A summer evening that changed everything. The neighborhood was bathed in the soft amber glow of streetlights, with a faint hum of crickets serenading the peaceful evening. This was the kind of suburb where the quiet was so profound it almost felt like a blanket, wrapping around the streets, homes, and the lives within them. It was a haven for those who cherish the serenity of a slower pace, a place where time seemed to move just a little more gently. Officer Paul Grant was finishing his shift. A 15-year veteran of the police force, Paul had built his reputation on vigilance and a meticulous eye for detail. He believed in his duty to protect and serve, and over the years, he had come to know the ins and outs of the neighborhood he patrolled. He could name the families in each house, recognize the regular dog walkers, and even predict which teenagers might test curfews on a Friday night. But tonight felt different. There was a subtle tension in the air, almost imperceptible, but enough to keep Paul alert. He drove slowly through the neighborhood, his cruiser gliding silently down the well-paved streets. As he passed a row of stately homes, his attention was drawn to a figure walking along the sidewalk. A woman in her mid-30s, casually dressed in a flowing yellow sundress, carried a small tote bag in one hand and a set of keys in the other. She walked with purpose but paused occasionally, glancing at the houses as if searching for something familiar. Her presence was unremarkable in many ways, but Paul found his gaze lingering. He realized he hadn't seen her before, and in a neighborhood this close-knit, new faces stood out. Paul slowed his cruiser, instinctively observing. The woman approached a large home, one of the grandest on the block, a 2-story colonial with a manicured lawn and a wraparound porch. Paul recognized the house immediately. The Jennings family had lived there for over a decade, though he hadn't seen them recently. They were known for hosting neighborhood barbecues and always keeping their porch light on, a beacon of their hospitality. The woman paused at the gate, fiddling with her keys. She glanced over her shoulder, her expression neutral but focused. Paul's instincts flared. Something about the situation felt off. He'd been trained to trust his gut, and while there was no apparent crime in progress, the unfamiliarity of the woman with the house she was approaching triggered a cautious response. Paul parked his cruiser at the curb and stepped out. His boots crunched softly against the gravel as he approached. The woman, now at the front door, seemed to struggle briefly with the lock before inserting a key and turning it. The door didn't open. "Excuse me, ma'am," Paul called out, keeping his tone polite but firm. The woman turned to face him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, their eyes locked, hers a deep, piercing brown, his a cautious blue. "Yes, officer," she replied, her voice steady but guarded. Paul stopped a few feet away, keeping a neutral posture. "Is everything all right here?" The woman raised an eyebrow, her grip tightening slightly on the keys. "I'm trying to get into my house." "Why do you ask?" Paul's heart quickened. "Your house," he echoed, his voice tinged with skepticism. He gestured toward the Grand Colonial. "This is your home." "That's right," she said, her tone clipped. "Is there a problem?" Paul hesitated. He couldn't recall the Jennings family moving out, and it was hard to imagine they'd sell their home without word spreading through the neighborhood. He cleared his throat. "I've been patrolling this area for years, and I don't think I've seen you around. Do you mind if I see some identification?" The woman's eyes narrowed, a flicker of irritation crossing her face. Slowly, she reached into her tote bag and pulled out a wallet. She handed him her driver's license, her movements deliberate. Paul examined the ID. "Elise Carter," he read aloud, glancing at the address listed. It matched the house number. Still, doubt gnawed at him. "How long have you lived here, Miss Carter?" "6 months," she replied curtly, crossing her arms. "And I'd appreciate it if you stopped treating me like a criminal." Paul felt a pang of guilt but pushed it aside. "I just want to make sure everything checks out," he said, handing back her ID. "If you don't mind, I'd like to verify the records." Elisa's expression hardened. "Fine," she said, her voice laced with frustration. "Do whatever you need to do." Paul stepped back, reaching for his radio to call in the information. As he relayed her name and the property address, he couldn't ignore the tension simmering between them. Elise leaned against the doorframe, her posture unyielding, her gaze fixed on him like a challenge. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio after a few moments. "Officer Grant, records show the property was sold 6 months ago to an Elise Carter." "Everything checks out." Paul froze, the words landing like a blow. His stomach sank as he processed the confirmation. She was telling the truth all along. He turned back to Elise, who was now watching him with a mixture of anger and weariness. "It looks like everything's in order," he said quietly, lowering his gaze. "I apologize for the inconvenience." "Inconvenience," she repeated, her voice sharp. "You stopped me in front of my own home, questioned my right to be here, and called it an inconvenience. Do you have any idea how insulting that is?" Paul swallowed hard, shame washing over him. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Elise shook her head, unlocking the door and stepping inside. Before closing it, she looked back at him one last time. "This isn't just about tonight," she said, her voice softer but no less firm. "It's about what people like me have to deal with every day. Think about that." The door clicked shut, leaving Paul standing alone on the porch. The quiet of the neighborhood pressed down on him, heavier than ever before. For the first time in his career, Paul found himself questioning not just his actions, but the assumptions that had guided them. As he walked back to his cruiser, the evening no longer felt serene. It felt complicated, tangled with questions he wasn't sure he could answer. And as he drove away, the hum of the engine drowned out by his thoughts, Paul realized this wasn't just another shift. This was a turning point, one he couldn't ignore. The echoes of assumptions. Paul Grant spent the rest of that evening in his patrol car, parked in a secluded lot near the edge of his district. The low hum of the engine filled the quiet space as he stared blankly at the dashboard, his thoughts a storm of emotions and self-recrimination. He'd always considered himself a fair officer, someone who treated everyone equally, someone who never allowed bias to dictate his actions. But tonight, Elise Carter's words had cracked that self-assured image. "This isn't just about tonight. It's about what people like me have to deal with every day." Those words echoed in his mind, forcing him to confront something he'd avoided for years. Had his actions been fueled by unconscious prejudice? He'd stopped Elise because he didn't recognize her, but had that instinct been shaped by something deeper, something he wasn't ready to admit? The next day, Paul woke early, despite having had little sleep. His one-bedroom apartment felt smaller than usual, the walls closing in with each passing minute. The morning sun streamed through the blinds, but the light felt harsh rather than comforting. He poured himself a cup of coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and opened his laptop. He hesitated, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. What was he even searching for? He didn't know the exact words, but he typed the first phrase that came to mind: unconscious bias in policing. The search results flooded his screen. Articles, studies, documentaries, and forums, all discussing a concept that felt both foreign and disturbingly familiar. Paul clicked on the first article, a research paper that outlined how implicit biases, subtle, often unintentional beliefs, could influence decision-making, even in professionals trained to be objective. As he read, he felt an uncomfortable heat rising in his chest. The examples given weren't overt racism or blatant prejudice, but small, everyday assumptions. A person who looked out of place in a neighborhood. A driver pulled over because of an instinct. These were decisions made in seconds, influenced by years of societal conditioning. And the data was undeniable. People of color bore the brunt of these biases. Paul leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Could he really claim to be any different? A memory resurfaces. Paul's thoughts drifted back to his childhood. He grew up in a small town where everyone knew each other. His father, a retired police sergeant, was a local hero. Paul idolized him, often tagging along to the station or sitting in on community events his father helped organize. But there was one incident Paul had buried deep in his memory, one he hadn't thought about in years. Paul had been about 10 years old when it happened. He was playing basketball at the local park with his friends when a black teenager, maybe 16 or 17, walked by. Paul didn't know him, but the older kids in the neighborhood had a nickname for him. Trouble. Don't go near him, one of Paul's friends whispered. He's always up to something. Paul didn't question it at the time. He watched as the teenager walked by, head down, hands stuffed into his pockets. A few minutes later, a police car pulled up. 2 officers got out and approached the teen, asking him questions. Paul remembered the teenager's face, tight with frustration but calm as he spoke to the officers. Later that evening, Paul overheard his father talking about the incident. They stopped him because he looked suspicious, his father had said. Turned out he hadn't done anything. Paul hadn't thought much of it then. But now, as he sat at his kitchen table, the memory took on a different weight. That teenager had been judged not by his actions, but by how he looked, by the assumptions others made about him. And Paul realized, with a sinking feeling, that he had done the same thing to Ellis Carter. A meeting with the captain. Later that morning, Paul headed to the station, still grappling with the revelations of the night before. The buzz of activity greeted him as he stepped inside. Officers filing reports, dispatchers coordinating calls, and detectives reviewing cases. Paul moved through it all, feeling like an outsider in his own workplace. He needed to talk to someone, and there was only one person he trusted with this, Captain Maria Cortez. She had been his mentor since he joined the force, guiding him through the challenges of the job with wisdom and a no-nonsense attitude. If anyone could help him make sense of what he was feeling, it was her. Paul knocked on the door to her office, and a muffled "come in" greeted him. Captain Cortez sat behind her desk, surrounded by stacks of files. Her sharp eyes flicked up from her paperwork as Paul entered. "Grant," she said, gesturing for him to sit. "What's on your mind?" Paul hesitated. How could he explain what had happened without sounding like he'd lost his grip? But as he sat down, the words spilled out. He recounted the encounter with Ellis Carter, the doubts that had plagued him since, and the uncomfortable truths he'd uncovered in his research. When he finished, Captain Cortez leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "You're not the first officer to have this realization," she said finally. "And you won't be the last." Paul frowned. "So what do I do? How do I make sure this doesn't happen again?" "You start by owning it," Cortez said, her tone firm. "You made a mistake. Acknowledge it. Learn from it. But don't stop there. If you're serious about change, you need to educate yourself and others, challenge your assumptions, and most importantly, listen to the people you serve. They'll tell you what they need, if you're willing to hear it." Paul nodded, her words sinking in. He had always thought of himself as a protector, someone who stood between the community and danger. But maybe protecting the community also meant protecting it from his own blind spots. An unexpected visit. That evening, as Paul prepared to leave the station, he saw Elise Carter standing in the lobby. She looked different from the tense woman he had encountered the night before. Her posture was relaxed, but her expression was serious. Paul hesitated before approaching her. "Miss Carter," he said cautiously, "what brings you here?" "I came to talk," she said, her voice steady. "About what happened last night." Paul gestured toward a bench in the corner of the lobby, and they sat down. Elise didn't mince words. She told him about the exhaustion of always being viewed with suspicion, of having to prove herself in spaces where she belonged. She recounted other encounters with officers, some far worse than the one they'd had. "You're not the worst I've dealt with," Elise admitted, "but that doesn't mean what you did was okay." Paul nodded, her words cutting through his defenses. "I know I messed up," he said quietly. "And I'm sorry. I don't know if that's enough. But I mean it." Elise studied him for a long moment. "It's a start," she said. "But if you really want to make things better, you need to do more than apologize. You need to change." "I'm trying," Paul said. "I've been reading, trying to understand how to do better." But it's a process. It is, Elise agreed. And it's not an easy one. But if you're serious, you'll stick with it. Paul nodded again, feeling a flicker of hope. This wasn't going to be a quick fix. But maybe, just maybe, it could be the beginning of something better. For him, for Elise, and for the community he had sworn to serve. Reflections in action. The days that followed Elise Carter's visit were anything but ordinary for Paul Grant. He carried her words with him like a weight, a reminder of what he had done, and a challenge to become better. Elise's visit had been unexpected, but her candor had left a lasting impression. She didn't want platitudes or excuses. She wanted change. Paul found himself approaching his work differently. The mundane aspects of his patrols, checking parked cars, watching for suspicious activity, responding to routine calls, felt heavier now. Every decision, every observation carried the potential for scrutiny, both from others and from himself. A new lens on the neighborhood. One late afternoon, Paul cruised through a part of his district he hadn't spent much time in, a more diverse stretch of the neighborhood that often felt disconnected from the polished affluence of the other streets. Here, the houses were smaller, the lawns less manicured. Kids played basketball in the street, their laughter echoing off the buildings. A group of older men gathered on a porch, chatting animatedly over bottles of soda. Paul realized how little he knew about the people here. Unlike the wealthier side of town, where he recognized nearly every face, this part of the neighborhood was a blank slate to him. He had always thought of his role as protecting the entire community, but now he wondered if he had unconsciously prioritized one group over another. As he drove, he spotted a teenage boy on a bike riding erratically down the street, weaving between cars. Paul slowed his cruiser and rolled down the window. "Hey, buddy," he called out. The boy stopped, his eyes wide with caution as he looked at the police car. "Yeah. You okay?" "That's a dangerous way to ride," Paul said, keeping his tone light. The boy nodded, still wary. "I'm fine." Paul hesitated. He could sense the unease in the boy's posture, the way his hands gripped the handlebars tightly. "What's your name?" he asked, trying to sound friendly. "Deshawn," the boy replied after a pause. "Well, Deshawn, I'd hate to see you get hurt. How about you ride on the sidewalk from here on out?" Deshawn nodded again, his expression softening slightly. "Okay." Paul watched as the boy pedaled away, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and discomfort. It was a small interaction, but it reminded him of how much work he had to do to rebuild trust, one moment at a time. The community meeting. A week later, Paul attended a community meeting at a local recreation center. He had been to these meetings before, but this one felt different. Elise Carter had mentioned the meeting during their conversation, and Paul had promised to attend. Now, as he stepped into the brightly lit room, he felt a pang of nervousness. The room was filled with a mix of people, parents, teenagers, elderly residents. Paul recognized a few faces, but most were unfamiliar. At the front of the room, a young woman with a clipboard was organizing papers. She introduced herself as Maria, a community organizer. "Thank you all for coming," Maria began. "Tonight, we're discussing ways to improve the relationship between our community and law enforcement. We've had concerns raised about profiling, over-policing, and the need for more transparency." Paul felt every eye in the room shift toward him. He had expected this, but it didn't make it any easier. Maria continued, "We're fortunate to have Officer Grant with us tonight. Officer, would you like to say a few words?" Paul stood, clearing his throat. "Thank you, Maria," he began, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "I know that trust between the police and the community isn't where it needs to be, and I know I've been part of that problem. I'm here tonight because I want to listen, to understand how I can do better." A murmur rippled through the room. Some faces softened, while others remained skeptical. Maria gestured for the discussion to begin, and residents shared their experiences. A young mother described being followed home by a patrol car for no apparent reason. An older man recounted a time when he was stopped and questioned while walking to his own mailbox. Each story added weight to the air, filling the room with unspoken pain. When it was Elise's turn to speak, she stood confidently, her voice clear and firm. "Officer Grant and I had an encounter recently that left me questioning whether I truly belonged in my own neighborhood," she said. "But I'm here tonight because he listened, and he's here now, willing to face this conversation. That's a start. But it's not enough." Paul nodded, absorbing her words. When the meeting ended, several residents approached him, some with questions, others with guarded hope. By the time he left, Paul felt both drained and determined. The ripple effect. In the weeks that followed, Paul began implementing small changes. He made a point of spending more time in the parts of the neighborhood he had previously overlooked. He attended more community meetings and reached out to residents individually, asking about their concerns and experiences. Each interaction chipped away at the divide he had once been blind to. Paul also pushed for changes within the department. He suggested hosting workshops on implicit bias and cultural sensitivity, emphasizing the importance of understanding the community they served. To his surprise, Captain Cortez supported his efforts, helping him secure resources and time for the initiatives. An unlikely partnership. One day, as Paul was leaving a local coffee shop, he ran into Elise. She was carrying a stack of books, and Paul offered to help. "I didn't expect to see you here," she said with a raised eyebrow. "Just grabbing coffee," he replied. "How about you?" "Community book club," she said. "We're reading about systemic racism and its impact on communities." Paul hesitated. "I've been reading about that too," he admitted, trying to learn more. Ellie studied him for a moment before smiling faintly. "Good. It's a start." They ended up sitting down for coffee, discussing books, documentaries, and the changes Paul was working on. By the end of their conversation, Paul felt a sense of cautious camaraderie. Elise didn't fully trust him yet, and he didn't blame her. But they had taken a step forward, however small. A new kind of patrol. One evening, Paul was patrolling when he saw Deshaun, the boy from before, playing basketball with his friends. Paul parked his cruiser and walked over. The boys stopped, their laughter fading as they watched him approach. "Can I play?" Paul asked, holding up his hands. The boys exchanged uncertain glances before tossing him the ball. Paul joined the game, his years on the force not erasing his rusty but decent jump shot. The tension eased as the boys realized he wasn't there to lecture or enforce rules. He was just a guy playing basketball. When the game ended, Deshaun approached him. "You're not like the other cops," he said quietly. Paul smiled, but the comment stung. "I'm trying to be better," he said. "For all of you." As he walked back to his cruiser, Paul felt a flicker of hope. He couldn't change the past, but he could shape the future, one small interaction at a time. And that, he realized, was where the real work began. Shifting perspectives. Paul Grant was beginning to feel the weight of change, not just in how he approached his job, but in how he understood the world. His shifts as a patrol officer now carried a deeper sense of responsibility, not just to enforce the law, but to reflect on how his actions affected the people he served. It was uncomfortable but necessary, and Paul was learning to embrace that discomfort. An unexpected call. It was a quiet afternoon when Paul's radio crackled to life. "Unit 14, respond to a disturbance at Oakwood Elementary. Caller reports an argument between a parent and school staff." Paul grabbed the mic. "Unit 14 en route." When he arrived at the school, he found a small crowd gathered near the main entrance. A man in his late 40s was gesturing wildly, his voice raised as he argued with a younger woman who appeared to be a teacher. Paul parked his cruiser and approached, his presence immediately drawing the attention of everyone around. "What's going on here?" Paul asked, keeping his voice calm but authoritative. The man turned to Paul, his face red with frustration. "This school's accusing my son of stealing. They're saying he took a tablet from the classroom, but he didn't do anything wrong." The teacher stepped forward, her demeanor composed but tense. "We're not accusing anyone, officer. We simply noticed the tablet was missing after class, and we're trying to figure out what happened. No one is in trouble yet." Paul nodded, taking in the scene. The man's son, a boy of about 10, stood behind his father, his eyes wide and brimming with tears. The crowd murmured, their voices carrying an undercurrent of tension. Paul crouched down to the boy's level. "Hey there," he said gently. "What's your name?" "Marcus," the boy whispered. "Marcus, do you know anything about the tablet?" Paul asked, his tone soft. The boy shook his head quickly. "No, sir. I didn't take it." Paul stood and addressed the father. "Let's step aside and talk. I'm here to help, not to accuse anyone." The father hesitated, then nodded. Paul led him a few feet away, out of earshot of the crowd. "Look," Paul said, "I understand you're upset, but let's figure this out together. Sometimes things get misplaced, and it's not always what it seems." The man's shoulders relaxed slightly, though his eyes still burned with indignation. "You don't know what it's like, officer," he said. "My son's a good kid, but people are always looking at him like he's up to no good, just because of how he looks." Paul felt a pang of recognition. He thought back to Ellis Carter's words, the community meeting, and the stories he'd heard. "I get it," Paul said quietly. "And I promise you, I'll treat this fairly." They returned to the group, and Paul addressed the teacher. "Let's search the classroom thoroughly. It might just be a misunderstanding." The teacher nodded, her expression softening. Paul offered to help with the search, and after a few minutes, they found the missing tablet wedged between two desks. Relief washed over the room, but Paul noticed that Marcus and his father still looked uneasy. "See," Paul said, crouching down to the boy again. "You didn't do anything wrong." Marcus nodded, a small smile creeping onto his face. His father thanked Paul quietly before leading his son away. As they left, Paul couldn't help but reflect on how easily the situation could have escalated if handled differently. Trust wasn't just about the big gestures. It was built, or broken, in moments like these. A visit to Ellis. Later that week, Paul decided to pay Ellis Carter a visit. He had been thinking about their conversation at the community meeting and wanted her perspective on his efforts. When he pulled up to her house, he saw her tending to a small garden in the front yard. She looked up as he approached, her expression wary but not unkind. "Officer Grant," she said, standing and brushing dirt off her hands. "To what do I owe this visit?" "Call me Paul," he said with a small smile. "I wanted to check in. After the community meeting, I've been trying to make changes, not just for myself but for the department. I was hoping to get your thoughts." Illy studied him for a moment, then gestured toward her porch. "All right, let's talk." They sat in the shade, the late afternoon sun casting a warm glow over the neighborhood. Paul told her about the workshops he was organizing, the time he was spending in overlooked parts of the community, and the small interactions that were slowly building bridges. Ellis listened intently, her expression thoughtful. "It's a good start," she said finally. "But you need to remember that change takes time. It's not just about you. It's about the system you're a part of. People need to see consistent effort, not just a one-time push." Paul nodded. "I get that. I don't want to be part of the problem anymore." Elise smiled faintly. "That's a step in the right direction. But actions speak louder than words, Paul." Their conversation drifted to lighter topics, her work as a freelance designer, his love for fishing on his days off. By the time Paul left, he felt a sense of camaraderie with Elise, though he knew he still had a long way to go to earn her full trust. Facing the department. Back at the station, Paul's efforts to introduce implicit bias training met resistance from some of his colleagues. Officers who had known Paul for years questioned his motivations, some even accusing him of pandering to public pressure. "What's gotten into you, Grant?" one officer, Steve, asked during a break. "You've been one of the most reliable guys here for years. Why are you acting like we're the bad guys now?" Paul leaned against the wall, choosing his words carefully. "I'm not saying we're bad guys, Steve, but I think we've got blind spots. I had one, and it almost cost me someone's trust. If we can learn to see those blind spots, we'll be better at our jobs, and better for the people we're supposed to serve." Steve snorted. "Sounds like you've been drinking the Kool-Aid." Paul didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he said, "You don't have to agree with me, but maybe give the workshop a chance. If it doesn't change your mind, fine. But if it does, maybe it'll make us better." The conversation ended there, but Paul knew it wouldn't be the last. Change was never easy, especially in an institution as entrenched as law enforcement. But Paul was determined to keep pushing, even if it meant standing alone. A glimpse of hope. One evening, as Paul was finishing his patrol, he spotted Marcus and his friends playing basketball again. This time, the boy waved at him, a bright smile on his face. Paul waved back, feeling a warmth he hadn't expected. Small moments, Paul thought. That's where it starts. He drove on, the streets of the neighborhood illuminated by the soft glow of streetlights. For the first time in years, Paul felt like he was truly seeing the community, not just the buildings and the crime statistics, but the people. And while he knew he couldn't change the world overnight, he also knew that every step he took mattered. One step at a time, one interaction at a time, one person at a time. The weight of leadership. As Paul Grant settled into his evolving role as both officer and advocate for change, he discovered that progress was neither linear nor easy. His newfound awareness of his blind spots forced him to confront uncomfortable truths, not just about himself, but also about the system he worked within. Every shift, every interaction, carried the weight of his commitment to do better. Yet, resistance from within and outside the department threatened to chip away at his resolve. A new incident. It was a cloudy afternoon when Paul responded to a call about a suspicious individual loitering near a high-end boutique on Main Street. The caller had described a young black man in a hoodie standing near the storefront. As Paul drove to the scene, he felt a knot of unease form in his stomach. These types of calls often relied on assumptions rather than evidence. When he arrived, he saw the young man leaning against the wall, scrolling through his phone. Paul parked his cruiser and approached cautiously, ensuring his body language was non-threatening. "Hey there," Paul said, stopping a few feet away. "Everything okay?" The young man looked up, startled but not defensive. "Yeah, I'm just waiting for my mom. She's inside shopping." Paul nodded, noticing the shopping bags at the young man's feet. "Got it. Someone called in, said they saw you standing out here and thought it was suspicious." The young man raised an eyebrow, a flicker of frustration crossing his face. "Suspicious? For standing here?" Paul held up a hand, trying to diffuse the tension. "I get it. It's not right. I'm just here to make sure there's no misunderstanding." The young man crossed his arms, his stance more guarded now. "Feels like there's always a misunderstanding when it comes to people like me." Paul hesitated, the words striking a chord. "I'm sorry you've had to deal with that," he said sincerely. "And I'm sorry I'm part of it today. But I promise, I'm here to listen, not to judge." Before the conversation could continue, a woman exited the boutique, holding several shopping bags. "Deander, sorry for the wait," she called out. She looked at Paul, her eyes narrowing. "Is there a problem, officer?" "No, ma'am," Paul said, stepping back. "Just making sure everything's okay." Deander picked up his bags and followed his mother toward their car, but not before glancing back at Paul. "You might want to tell whoever called you that standing around isn't a crime." Paul nodded, feeling the sting of the young man's words. As he returned to his cruiser, he realized how fragile trust could be. Even when handled with care, situations like this left scars. Confronting the department. The next morning, Paul requested a meeting with Captain Cortez. As he stepped into her office, he felt the weight of the past few months pressing down on him. He needed to address the growing tension within the department and the resistance he faced from some of his colleagues. Cortez motioned for him to sit. "What's on your mind, Grant?" Paul leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Captain, I need your support on this. The workshops, the community outreach, it's not enough if the department doesn't buy in. Some of the officers are outright dismissing the effort, and it's undermining what we're trying to do." Cortez's expression hardened. "I've noticed the pushback. Change makes people uncomfortable, Paul. But you're not wrong to push for it. What are you proposing?" Paul hesitated, then said, "Mandatory bias training for every officer, not just those who volunteer. We need to face this head-on, as a department." Cortez nodded slowly, her fingers tapping on her desk. "That's a bold move. You'll make enemies." "I already have," Paul said with a wry smile. "But this isn't about being popular. It's about doing what's right." Cortez leaned back, her expression thoughtful. "All right, Grant. I'll back you on this. But you'd better be ready for the fallout. A fractured brotherhood." Paul's proposal was met with mixed reactions. Younger officers, many of whom were eager to build trust with the community, embraced the training. But veterans like Steve pushed back hard. "This is ridiculous," Steve said during a meeting. "We've been doing this job for decades without someone telling us we're biased. What's next? Sensitivity training for writing parking tickets." Paul stood at the front of the room, addressing a group of officers during a department-wide meeting. He looked directly at Steve. "It's not about calling anyone out. It's about making sure we're aware of the decisions we make and the impact they have. If we can do our jobs better, why wouldn't we want to?" Steve scoffed but said nothing further. Paul felt the room's tension but refused to back down. Change wasn't supposed to be easy, he reminded himself. An ally emerges. After the meeting, a younger officer named Riley approached Paul. She was new to the force, her badge still shining with the luster of idealism. "Officer Grant," she said, "I just wanted to say I appreciate what you're doing. My brother was stopped by police a few years ago for no reason. It scared him so much he doesn't even drive at night anymore. If we can prevent things like that, I'm all in." Paul felt a swell of gratitude. "Thanks, Riley. It means a lot to hear that. We got a long road ahead, but every step counts." A neighborhood BBQ. A few weeks later, Paul was invited to a neighborhood barbecue hosted by Elise Carter. The invitation surprised him, but he took it as a sign of progress. When he arrived, the backyard was filled with people laughing, grilling, and playing music. Elise greeted him with a nod. "Glad you could make it." Paul spent the afternoon mingling with residents, many of whom he had only interacted with during tense encounters. He listened to their stories, their frustrations, and their hopes for a better relationship with law enforcement. By the end of the day, Paul felt something he hadn't in a long time: hope. As he left, Elise walked him to his car. "You've come a long way," she said. "But remember, this isn't just about you. It's about everyone who comes after you." Paul nodded, her words sinking deep. "I won't forget." A defining moment. One evening, Paul received a call about a domestic disturbance. When he arrived, he found a chaotic scene. A couple arguing loudly, their children huddled in a corner. Paul's years of training kicked in, but this time, he approached with a different mindset. He diffused the situation calmly, ensuring everyone felt heard and safe. By the time he left, the tension had eased, and the family had begun to talk things through. It was a small victory, but it reminded Paul why he had joined the force in the first place. As he drove back to the station, he thought about the journey he had taken. It hadn't been easy, and he knew it was far from over. But for the first time, he felt like he was making a real difference, not just for the community, but for himself and the department he was trying to transform. A quiet reflection. That night, Paul sat in his apartment, staring out the window at the city lights. The weight of the past few months settled over him, but so did a sense of purpose. He wasn't just an officer anymore. He was a bridge builder, a listener, and a learner. Change was slow, often painful, and never perfect, but it was worth it. And Paul Grant was determined to keep walking the path he had started, one step at a time. A new legacy, Months had passed since Paul Grant began his journey toward self-awareness and systemic change. Each day brought its own challenges, but it also brought moments of clarity, small victories that reminded him why he had started this difficult path in the first place. Paul no longer saw his job as just enforcing the law. He saw it as a bridge between the community and the department, a role that demanded vulnerability, accountability, and persistence. The protest. On a crisp Saturday morning, the city buzzed with the energy of a planned protest. Organized by a coalition of community groups, the protest was meant to address issues of racial profiling and inequity in policing. Paul wasn't on duty that day, but he chose to attend as a participant, not as an officer. When he arrived at the city square, he was struck by the sheer size of the crowd. People of all ages and backgrounds held signs, chanted slogans, and marched together in a show of unity. Paul recognized some faces from the community meetings he'd attended, as well as fellow officers, including Riley, who had become one of his strongest allies. Elise Carter spotted him standing near the edge of the crowd and approached, a faint smile on her face. "Didn't think I'd see you here," she said. Paul shrugged, figured it was time to show up in a different way. Elise studied him for a moment before nodding. "Good. Just remember, being here doesn't mean you're done. It means you're just getting started." The protest was peaceful, its message powerful. As Paul marched alongside the community, he felt a sense of solidarity he hadn't experienced before. He wasn't there as an outsider or an authority figure. He was there as a person willing to learn and grow. The department's reaction. Word of Paul's participation spread quickly through the department. By Monday morning, it was the topic of every conversation in the precinct. Some officers viewed his attendance as a betrayal, while others saw it as a brave step forward. Steve, one of Paul's most vocal critics, confronted him in the break room. "What the hell were you thinking, Grant? Marching with people who want to tear us down." Paul set his coffee mug on the counter, meeting Steve's glare. "They're not trying to tear us down, Steve. They're trying to hold us accountable. There's a difference." Steve scoffed. "Accountable? They don't know what we go through out there. They think they can solve everything with a sign and a chant." Paul sighed, his patience wearing thin. "Maybe they don't know everything we go through, but have you ever stopped to think we don't know everything they go through either? That's why I'm listening, Steve. Maybe you should try it." Steve didn't respond, but Paul noticed the subtle shift in his expression. The conversation hadn't changed Steve's mind, but it had planted a seed of doubt, and for Paul, that was enough for now. The graduation. One of the most rewarding changes in Paul's work came from his mentorship of new recruits. After advocating for implicit bias training, Paul was asked to speak at the Academy's graduation ceremony. He felt honored but also deeply aware of the responsibility that came with the role. Standing at the podium in front of a room filled with fresh-faced cadets, Paul took a deep breath. "When I first joined the force," he began, "I thought I had all the answers. I thought being a good officer meant following the rules and trusting my instincts. But what I've learned, what I'm still learning, is that being a good officer means questioning yourself, your assumptions, and even the system you're part of." The room was silent, the cadets hanging on his every word. "You're going to make mistakes," Paul continued. "I've made plenty. But what matters is how you respond to those mistakes, whether you choose to grow from them or let them define you. This badge isn't just a symbol of authority, it's a symbol of responsibility. And that responsibility includes earning the trust of the people you serve, every single day." When Paul stepped off the stage, he felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't expected. If even one cadet took his words to heart, it could ripple outward, creating change far beyond what he could accomplish alone. A crisis in the community. One evening, Paul was called to a community center where a dispute had escalated into a full-blown confrontation. Two local youth groups had clashed during a basketball tournament, and tensions were boiling over. By the time Paul arrived, the parking lot was filled with shouting teenagers and worried parents. Paul stepped out of his cruiser, his presence immediately drawing attention. He raised his hands, palms out, as he approached the crowd. "All right, "Everyone, let's take a step back and cool down," he said, his voice calm but firm. One of the group leaders, a young man named Jamal, pointed an accusatory finger at the opposing group. "They started it, officer. They've been trash-talking all night." The other group leader, a girl named Tara, shot back, "We were just playing. They're the ones who got physical." Hall held up his hands again. "I hear both of you," he said, "but yelling at each other isn't going to solve this. Let's figure it out together." He spent the next hour mediating between the groups, helping them see each other's perspectives. By the end of the night, the teens were shaking hands, their anger replaced by reluctant smiles. As the crowd dispersed, Jamal approached Paul. "You didn't have to do all that," Jamal said. "Most cops would have just broken it up and left." Paul smiled. "It's not just about breaking things up, Jamal. It's about making sure they don't break again." Elisa's words come full circle. Months later, Paul was walking through the neighborhood when he saw Elise Carter sitting on her porch. He waved, and she gestured for him to come over. "How's it going, Officer Grant?" she asked, a teasing note in her voice. "Busy," Paul admitted, sitting on the steps. "But good. I think we're starting to see some real change." Elise nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You've come a long way since that night outside my house." Paul chuckled. "Feels like a lifetime ago." "It wasn't," Elise said softly. "But you're not the same person you were then, and that's what matters." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the sounds of the neighborhood humming around them. Paul realized how much Elise's words had shaped his journey, pushing him to confront not just his own biases, but the systemic issues he had once ignored. A quiet victory. That night, as Paul drove through the neighborhood, he saw familiar faces. Diender and his mother walking home with groceries, Marcus playing basketball with his friends, Jamal and Tara joking outside the community center. Each interaction, each relationship, felt like a small but significant step toward healing. Paul knew he couldn't fix everything. The system was too big, the problems too deep. But he also knew that change started with individuals, one officer, one resident, one conversation at a time. As he parked his cruiser at the end of his shift, Paul sat for a moment, staring at the quiet streets he had come to know so well. He thought about the legacy he wanted to leave, not just as an officer, but as a person. Change wasn't about grand gestures or quick fixes. It was about persistence, humility, and the willingness to keep moving forward, even when the path was hard. Paul Grant wasn't done learning. He wasn't done growing. But for the first time, he felt like he was truly making a difference, not just in the community, but in himself. And that, he realized, was the legacy he wanted to leave behind.